The emergency room of Metropolitan General was a symphony of perpetual crisis, a place where the air itself felt like a toxic soup of antiseptic, iron-tinged blood, and the sharp, acidic tang of fear. It operated on a rhythm of controlled chaos, a frantic ballet of gurneys and IV drips, of shouted codes, and the relentless, electronic heartbeat of 100 monitors. Within this high-stakes ecosystem, a rigid hierarchy governed every interaction. It was a kingdom of noise, and at its apex sat Dr. Alistair Finch, the chief of emergency medicine, a man whose tailored suits seemed as sharp and unyielding as his pronouncements. His presence filled a room long before he spoke, his confidence a tangible force field that repelled doubt and demanded deference. He moved through the chaos, not as a participant, but as a conductor, orchestrating the frantic movements of his orchestra with flicks of his wrist and condescending critiques. If you've been watching this channel for a while, you know we explore stories about hidden talents and the moments they are revealed. The story you are about to hear is one of the most powerful examples we have ever come across. So if you are new here, make sure you subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss another story that will change the way you see the world. And for everyone, let us know what city you are watching from in the comments below. It is always amazing to see how far these stories travel. And then there was Alara. In the kingdom of noise, she was a ghost. Nurse Alara Vance. To the residents and junior nurses, she was the Mouse, a nickname whispered with a mixture of pity and mild irritation. She was of an age that was hard to place, her face lined with a quiet weariness that could have been forged by 30 years or 50. Her movements were slow, deliberate, almost apologetic. When she reached for a supply tray, she seemed to second-guess her own hands. When she spoke, her voice was so soft it was often swallowed by the ER's din, forcing people to lean in and invariably repeat their questions with a sigh. She was meticulous to a fault, her charting a model of perfect, block-lettered clarity, but it took her twice as long as anyone else. Her posture was a permanent stoop, as if she were trying to shrink herself out of existence, to take up less space in a world that already seemed to have no room for her. Dr. Finch, in particular, seemed to derive a special, cruel pleasure from her presence. He treated her not as a colleague, but as a piece of faulty equipment. He would speak about her while she was standing right there, his voice dripping with theatrical exasperation. "Can someone please find Nurse Vance and explain the concept of urgency to her?" he would say, loud enough for the entire trauma bay to hear. Or he would snatch a chart from her hands, glance at it, and toss it back onto the counter with a dismissive flick. "Still on this one, nurse? The patient will have recovered from old age by the time you finish your paperwork." Each comment was a small, public stoning, and Alara would simply absorb it, her expression unchanging, her gaze dropping to the floor before she would quietly resume her task. She never defended herself. She never spoke up. She just was. A quiet, unassuming fixture, as much a part of the ER as the humming refrigerators and the faint, constant smell of bleach. Yet, there were things no one noticed. Tiny, discordant notes in the otherwise seamless symphony of her meekness. When she prepared an IV line, her hands, though slow, moved with an unnatural economy. There were no wasted gestures, no fumbling with the catheter or the tubing. It was a single, fluid process, each step flowing into the next with the precision of a machine. It was a process that was slow, not because of incompetence, but because of an ingrained, almost religious adherence to a protocol no one else in the ER even knew. They saw slowness. They did not see the laminar flow of perfect muscle memory. There was also the way she watched things. While others focused on the immediate, bloody reality of a wound, Alara's eyes would scan the periphery. She noted the subtle tremor in a patient's hand, the faint cyanotic tinge to their nail beds, the almost imperceptible scent of acetone on their breath. Her gaze would linger on the pattern of dust on a paramedic's boots, the specific way a piece of clothing was torn, the mechanics of a patient's breathing. These observations never made it into her verbal reports, which were always clipped and factual, but they were filed away, processed by some deep, quiet part of her mind. They were pieces of a puzzle she was constantly, unconsciously assembling. On her left forearm, just peeking out from the cuff of her oversized scrubs, was the faint, silvery trace of a scar. It was not the jagged line of a kitchen accident or a drunken fall. It was a perfect, geometric shape, a series of interlocking lines that looked almost like a stylized bird or a weapon. No one ever asked about it. To ask would be to acknowledge her, to see her as a person with a history, and in the frantic calculus of the ER, Alara Vance was not a person. She was a function, and a slow one at that. She was a ghost in blue scrubs, haunting the edges of life-and-death dramas, a silent observer in a world that had mistaken silence for emptiness. This was her penance, her self-imposed exile. She had once been a master of chaos, a commander of crises. Now, she was the mouse, and that was the price she had decided she must pay. One Tuesday afternoon, under the jaundiced glare of the fluorescent lights, Dr. Finch decided to make an example of her. A patient had come in with a complicated allergic reaction, and Finch had prescribed a rapid infusion of a powerful antihistamine. Alara, tasked with administering it, was setting up the infusion pump with her usual painstaking deliberation. Finch strode over, his expensive leather shoes squeaking on the linoleum. "Nurse Vance," he began, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that cut through the surrounding noise. The nearby staff fell silent, sensing the impending spectacle. "Is there a particular reason you are treating this infusion pump as if it were a delicate piece of Ming porcelain? The patient is in anaphylaxis, not waiting for a tea ceremony." Alara did not look up. Her fingers continued their methodical work, checking the saline lock, ensuring the tubing was perfectly free of air bubbles. "The dosage calculation for this medication at this infusion rate requires careful verification, doctor," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "A bolus error could induce a paradoxical hypertensive crisis." Finch let out a short, incredulous laugh. He snatched the IV bag from the stand, dangling it in front of her face. "A hypertensive crisis? Nurse, I have been doing this since you were, well, since whenever you began your long, meandering journey into nursing. I am the chief of emergency medicine. My orders are not suggestions to be debated by the ancillary staff. Are you questioning my medical judgment?" He leaned in, his voice dropping to a hiss. "Or are you simply incompetent?" The silence in the trauma bay was absolute. Every eye was on the small, stooped woman and the towering, indignant doctor. Alara finally looked up, and for a fleeting second, her eyes met his. In their depths, there was no fear, no anger, no humiliation. There was only a vast, cold emptiness, a stillness that was more unsettling than any emotional response. It was the look of a statue built over a volcano. Then it was gone. Her gaze dropped back to her hands. "No, doctor," she murmured. "I am not." She took the IV bag from his hand, her touch gentle but firm, and continued her work. Finch, seemingly satisfied with his public display of dominance, snorted and turned away, resuming his rounds as if nothing had happened. The other nurses and doctors quickly went back to their own tasks, a collective, unspoken shame hanging in the air. Chloe, a young nurse who had only been in the ER for 3 months, watched Alara's hands. She saw them tremble, just once, a microscopic tremor that lasted less than a second. It was the only crack in the placid facade. Chloe felt a pang of something she couldn't name, a fierce, protective pity for the quiet woman everyone treated like a piece of furniture. She made a mental note to bring Alara a cup of tea later, a small gesture of kindness in a place that seemed to have none. The afternoon bled into evening, the controlled chaos of the day shift giving way to the more unpredictable frenzy of the night. The air grew thick and heavy, charged with the latent energy of a city after dark. It was just after 7 p.m. when the world broke. It started not with a bang, but with a sound, a specific, multi-toned chime from the overhead speaker system, a sound reserved for the highest level of emergency. It was the mass casualty alert. Every head in the ER snapped up. Conversations died mid-sentence. The rhythmic beeping of the monitors suddenly seemed menacing, a countdown to oblivion. Then the dispatcher's voice, strained but clear, crackled through the speakers. "Mass casualty incident declared. Multi-vehicle pileup on the I-5 connector bridge. I repeat, multi-vehicle pileup. Estimated 50-plus victims. First wave of ambulances en route. ETA, 6 minutes." The ER exploded. It was no longer a ballet. It was a stampede. Nurses rushed to clear bays, shouting for gurneys and crash carts. Doctors barked orders, triaging patients who were already there, deciding who was stable enough to be moved. The systemic chaos was immediate and overwhelming. The carefully maintained veneer of control shattered into a million pieces. Dr. Finch stood in the center of the storm, his face a mask of strained authority. "All right, listen up," he yelled, his voice barely cutting through the cacophony. "I want trauma bays 1 through 4 cleared for red tags, 5 and 6 for yellow. Get me extra surgical residents down here now. Peds, clear your wing for overflow. I want every available hand on deck." He was in his element, the conductor of a much larger, more violent symphony. But for the first time, a hairline crack appeared in his perfect confidence. His eyes darted around, trying to process a dozen streams of information at once. He was making rushed, superficial judgments, his focus on volume and speed, not on nuance. Alara, who had been quietly restocking a supply cabinet, simply stopped. She placed a box of gauze on the shelf, her movements as deliberate as ever. She closed her eyes for a single, long second. In the roaring chaos of the ER, she found a pocket of absolute silence within herself. The frantic shouts, the rolling gurneys, the blaring alarms, it all faded into a dull, distant roar. This was a place she knew. This was the storm. She had lived her entire former life in the eye of it. Her stooped posture straightened, just a fraction of an inch. Her shoulders, usually rounded in a permanent apology, squared themselves. It was an almost imperceptible shift, a statue subtly resettling on its foundations. The first wave of ambulances arrived like a tidal wave of sirens and flashing lights. The doors of the ER burst open, and the true horror began to spill in. Paramedics wheeled in gurney after gurney, their faces grim, their uniforms stained. The air filled with screams, moans, and the clipped, breathless reports of injuries. Male, 40s, crush injury to the chest, paradoxical breathing. Female, 20s, massive head trauma, unresponsive. Multiple fractures, severe lacerations, hypotensive. Finch was at the door, playing traffic cop with human lives. He pointed, shouted, and directed the flow. Bay 1, get him to Bay 1, prep for chest tube. Bay 3 for her, get neuro on the phone. Bay 4. His triage was fast, brutal, and based on the most obvious catastrophic injuries. He was clearing the logjam, processing the bodies, keeping the system from collapsing under the sheer volume. It was, in its own way, an impressive display of logistical command. But it was the command of a quartermaster, not a diagnostician. Amid the flood of broken bodies, one gurney was wheeled in almost as an afterthought. On it lay a small child, a boy no older than 7. He was conscious, his eyes wide with shock, a single clean cut on his forehead bleeding sluggishly. A young, rattled paramedic was pushing the gurney. Minor injuries, the paramedic said, his voice shaky. He was in the back of a minivan that got clipped. Complains of a headache. Vitals are stable. Dr. Finch gave the boy a cursory glance, his attention already on the next, more grievously wounded patient coming through the door. Okay, stable. Put him in the pediatric overflow. Get a resident to check him for a concussion when they have a minute. Tag him green. He waved them on, dismissing the child as a low-priority case, a piece of administrative clutter in the midst of his war. The paramedic, relieved, began to wheel the boy toward the designated corner for the walking wounded. But as the gurney passed Alara, she put a hand out, gently but firmly stopping its progress. She did not look at the paramedic. Her eyes were fixed on the child. The boy, shivering with shock, looked back at her. Alara leaned down, her face just inches from his. The chaos of the ER seemed to recede, creating a small, silent bubble around the two of them. She ignored the cut on his forehead. Her gaze was analytical, her senses fully engaged. She saw the faint, almost invisible bruising on his abdomen, a mottled, purple pattern that looked like the imprint of a seatbelt buckle, but with a strange, asymmetrical distribution. She noticed the way he held his left arm tight against his side, not as if it were broken, but as if he were trying to hold himself together. And then she smelled it. Faint, sweet, and utterly wrong. The scent of acetone. The smell of a body consuming itself from the inside out. It was a scent she knew from 100 dusty, desperate field hospitals, the calling card of catastrophic internal distress. "What's your name?" she asked, her voice low and calm, a stark contrast to the surrounding hysteria. "Leo," the boy whispered, his teeth chattering. "Okay, Leo," Alara said. "I'm Alara. Can you take a deep breath for me?" The boy tried, but his intake of air was shallow, hitched. He winced, a tiny, almost imperceptible motion. It was not the sharp pain of a broken rib. It was the deep, pulling agony of a compromised diaphragm. Finch had seen a boy with a headache. Alara saw a ticking time bomb. She knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that the boy was bleeding internally. Massively. His stable vitals were a lie, the temporary compensation of a young, strong heart that was about to fail. Finch's diagnosis was not just wrong. It was a death sentence. Something inside her, a mechanism of duty and command she had spent years trying to dismantle, clicked into place. The mouse was gone. The ghost had vanished. In her place stood a woman whose every line and angle had suddenly sharpened into a weapon. Her posture was no longer stooped. It was a coiled spring. Her eyes, once downcast and empty, now burned with a cold, analytical fire. She turned to the young paramedic, and when she spoke, her voice was unrecognizable. It was not loud, but it possessed an absolute, unbreakable authority that cut through the noise like a surgeon's scalpel. "Take him to Trauma Bay 1. Now." The paramedic stared at her, confused. "But Dr. Finch said—" Alara's eyes narrowed. She did not raise her voice. She didn't need to. "I am aware of the doctor's assessment. It is incorrect. This child is the most critical patient in this hospital. Move him." The sheer, unshakable certainty in her voice was hypnotic. The paramedic, caught between the chief of the ER's bellowed order and this quiet nurse's steel-enforced command, found himself obeying the nurse. He turned the gurney and began pushing it toward the main trauma bay, which was currently being prepped for a severe crush injury victim. Chloe, the young nurse, had been rushing supplies to Bay 2 when she saw the exchange. She saw Alara stop the gurney. She saw her lean down, and she saw the change. It was like watching a drab gray moth suddenly burst from its chrysalis as a hawk. The slow, hesitant woman she had felt pity for was gone. In her place was a figure of immense, terrifying competence. Alara's movements were no longer apologetic. They were brutally efficient. She walked alongside the gurney, her stride long and purposeful, her eyes scanning every monitor, every piece of equipment, her mind clearly 10 steps ahead of everyone else in the room. As they reached the entrance to Trauma Bay 1, a senior resident, Dr. Chen, intercepted them. Whoa, where are you going? This bay is for the chest trauma coming in. Alara didn't break stride. Reroute the chest trauma to Bay 5. I need this room. You need this room? Chen scoffed, bewildered. On whose authority? Dr. Finch specifically ordered. Alara stopped and turned to face him fully. Her gaze was like a physical weight. On the authority of the fact that this child will be dead in less than 10 minutes if we follow Dr. Finch's orders. He has a massive internal hemorrhage, likely a ruptured spleen and a torn diaphragm. His blood pressure is about to drop off a cliff. We are past the point of discussion. She pushed the gurney past the stunned resident and into the trauma bay. Chloe, her heart pounding, watched this quiet revolution unfold. She had seen Dr. Finch tear strips off senior surgeons for less. But there was something about Alara now, an aura of such profound certainty that it defied the hospital's rigid hierarchy. It was not insubordination. It was a reordering of reality. Without a second thought, Chloe abandoned her task and followed Alara into the bay. She didn't know why, but she knew, with absolute conviction, that this was where she needed to be. She had just become the first follower in a new chain of command. One based not on title, but on pure, undeniable competence. The unveiling had begun. Inside Trauma Bay 1, the space was a chaotic jumble of prepped equipment for a different patient. Alara ignored it all. Her focus was lasered onto the boy, Leo, and the ticking clock of his life. Chloe, she said, her new voice a precise instrument. She had never called the younger nurse by name before. Get me 2 large-bore IVs, 16 gauge. Hang 2 units of O-negative blood and start a wide-open saline drip. I need a portable ultrasound machine in here 60 seconds ago. And tell the blood bank to prep a mass transfusion protocol for a 30-kilogram pediatric patient. Code it Anvil. Chloe blinked, the unfamiliar code word registering a beat later than the rest of the instructions. Anvil? She repeated, puzzled. Just tell them, Alara commanded, her attention already elsewhere. She was stripping away the boy's jacket and shirt with a series of swift, efficient movements, exposing his small torso. The mottled bruising over his abdomen was even clearer now, a dark, ugly bloom against his pale skin. Chloe, galvanized by the sheer force of Alara's will, flew into action. She grabbed the IV kits, her hands moving faster than they ever had before. She relayed the orders for the blood and the ultrasound to a floating ward clerk, her voice sharp with an urgency she was borrowing from Alara. The clerk looked at her, then at the transformed nurse in the trauma bay, and simply nodded, rushing to the phone. The name Anvil was strange, but the command was not. Dr. Finch, having just dispatched another critical patient, noticed the disruption at Trauma Bay 1. He saw the green-tagged, low-priority child in his most vital trauma suite. His face darkened with fury. He strode toward the bay, a storm of righteous indignation about to break. What in God's name is going on here? He boomed from the doorway. I ordered that child to the pediatric wing. I gave you a direct order, Nurse Vance. This is my most critical bay, and you have contaminated it with a non-emergent case. Alara did not flinch. She was palpating the boy's abdomen, her fingertips impossibly gentle yet probing deep, mapping the landscape of his injury. This child is dying, doctor, she stated, the words flat and cold. He has a grade 4 or 5 splenic laceration and probable diaphragmatic rupture with visceral herniation. His stable vitals are a compensatory illusion that is about to collapse. Finch's face went from angry to purple with apoplectic rage. A splenic laceration? A diaphragmatic rupture? That is a ridiculous, hysterical diagnosis based on what? A hunch? A feeling? I am the attending physician here. I made the assessment. He has a mild concussion. Now get him out of my trauma bay before I have you fired and your license revoked. He took a step forward, intending to grab the gurney himself. It was in that moment that Alara acted. She moved from the side of the bed to the foot of it in a single fluid motion, placing herself directly in Finch's path. She did not raise her hands. She did not make a threat. She simply stood there, a small, unmovable object. Her gaze was not defiant. It was absolute. "You will not touch this child," she said. The words were quiet, but they echoed in the sudden silence of the bay. "You will not move him. Your assessment is wrong. Your order is lethal. You are relieved of command of this case." The sheer, monumental audacity of the statement hung in the air. A nurse, a mouse, had just fired the chief of emergency medicine from his own trauma bay. The other staff in the vicinity froze, their mouths agape. This was not just insubordination. It was madness. It was a career suicide of the most spectacular order. Finch was speechless for a moment, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. Then he found his voice. "Relieved? You are relieving me? You are finished, Vance. Security!" he bellowed, turning his head toward the hallway. "Get security in here, now! Remove this nurse!" Just as he shouted, the portable ultrasound machine arrived, pushed by a breathless tech. At the same time, the cardiac monitor connected to Leo let out a sudden, piercing shriek. Every head snapped toward it. The boy's blood pressure, which had been a stable 110/70, had plummeted to 60/30 in the space of 5 seconds. His heart rate shot up to 180 as his body made one last, desperate attempt to circulate the remaining blood. The compensatory phase had ended. The cliff Alara had predicted had arrived. The room fell into a deafening silence, broken only by the frantic, high-pitched alarm of the monitor. The miracle had begun, but it was a miracle of terrifying prescience. Alara had not been guessing. She had been reading the future. "Too late for security," Alara said, her voice cutting through the panic like ice. She grabbed the ultrasound probe from the tech. "Chloe, push the first unit of blood, now. Squeeze the bag." She squirted a cold dollop of gel onto the boy's abdomen and pressed the probe to his skin. On the screen, a grainy black and white image appeared. To the untrained eye, it was meaningless static. But Alara angled the probe with an expert's touch, and the image resolved. The entire right side of the screen was a dark, swirling mass. Black. On an ultrasound, black meant fluid. It was blood. A massive, horrifying amount of free fluid in the peritoneal cavity. She moved the probe up, angling it between the ribs. The diaphragm, which should have been a clean white line, was shattered. Loops of what looked like bowel were visible in the chest cavity. "There," Alara said, her voice devoid of any triumph. "Massive hemoperitoneum from a shattered spleen. And there's your diaphragmatic hernia. He's bleeding out and suffocating at the same time." She looked up, not at Finch, but at the stunned resident, Dr. Chin. "Page Dr. Evans in cardiothoracic surgery. Tell him we have an emergent traumatic diaphragmatic rupture with splenic avulsion. Tell him he has 5 minutes to get to OR3, or we lose him." The social geometry of the room redrew itself in that instant. Dr. Finch, his face ashen, his mouth hanging open, was suddenly invisible. He was no longer the center of the universe. He was a ghost, a relic of a defunct command structure. Every single person in the bay, Chloe, Dr. Chin, the tech, the other nurses who had gathered at the door, was now looking at Alara. Their gazes were a mixture of terror, awe, and utter, absolute deference. The chief of the ER had been screaming for security, but now his words were just empty noise. The real authority in the room was the quiet nurse holding the ultrasound probe. Chen, shaking himself out of his stupor, nodded mutely and sprinted out of the room, shouting for a phone. Chloe, her own fear submerged by a wave of adrenaline and awe, squeezed the bag of blood, her eyes locked on Alara, waiting for the next command. The hierarchy had not just been challenged, it had been utterly and irrevocably inverted. Power had shifted from the title on a lab coat to the knowledge in a person's hands. The mouse was now the lion, and the entire ER was her domain. "We're taking him up ourselves," Alara announced, her voice ringing with an authority that no one dared question. "Chloe, you're on the blood. Chen," she called out to the resident who was now back in the doorway, "you manage his airway. I'll monitor vitals and control the gurney. We move on my count. Fast, but smooth. Like he's made of glass." The team that had spontaneously formed around her moved with a single mind. There were no questions, no hesitation. Alara's commands were the only reality. Dr. Finch remained frozen near the doorway, a statue of obsolete power. People moved around him as if he were a piece of furniture. His face had cycled through a kaleidoscope of emotions. Rage, disbelief, humiliation, and finally, a dawning, sickening horror. It was the horror of a man realizing he had not just been wrong, but catastrophically, lethally wrong. He had been about to send a dying child to a quiet corner to wait for a resident, to die of a mild concussion. The thought was so monstrous, it seemed to suck the air from his lungs. On 3, Alara said, her hand on the gurney. 1, 2, 3. They moved, a small, focused unit of purpose, cutting through the wider chaos of the ER. They were an island of laminar flow in a sea of turbulence. As they wheeled the gurney out of the trauma bay and toward the elevators, the other staff in the ER parted for them like the Red Sea. The shouts and frantic energy of the mass casualty response seemed to dim in their wake. Everyone saw it. They saw the ashen-faced Dr. Finch, ignored and irrelevant. They saw the quiet, mousy nurse at the head of the gurney, her face set in a mask of intense concentration, her every movement radiating a competence that was almost physically palpable. They saw the entire social order of their world being rewritten before their eyes. They reached the surgical elevators, and Alara hit the button with the back of her hand. As they waited, the doors to the ambulance bay burst open again, and 2 men in military-style uniforms, their faces grim, strode in, flanking a paramedic. "We need to find Nurse Vance," one of them said, his voice urgent. "We were told she works here." A nearby clerk, flustered, pointed a trembling finger toward the elevators. She's right there." The men's eyes locked onto Alara. Their expressions shifted from urgency to a kind of relieved reverence. But Alara didn't see them. Her entire world was the small boy on the gurney and the flickering numbers on the monitor. The elevator doors opened, and she pushed the gurney inside. Chloe and Chin followed. Just before the doors closed, one of the uniformed men called out, his voice sharp with authority. "Commander!" The doors slid shut, sealing Alara and her team in the small metal box. Inside, Chloe looked at Alara, her eyes wide with a million questions. Commander? What did that mean? But Alara's focus was absolute. She was making a minute adjustment to the saline drip, her mind already in the operating room, planning the first incision. The past was trying to break through, but the present was too demanding. Upstairs, the surgical team was waiting. Dr. Evans, the head of cardiothoracic surgery, was a notoriously prickly and arrogant man, second only to Finch in ego. He had been scrubbed and ready, annoyed at being pulled into what he assumed was a misdiagnosed case from the ER chaos. "All right, what have we got?" he asked impatiently as the gurney rolled in. "Chin, you said a traumatic diaphragm? The ER always overcalls these." His voice trailed off as he saw the ultrasound screen still frozen with the image Alara had taken. He stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. He looked at the image, then at the boy's vital signs on the monitor, then back at the image. A look of profound seriousness washed over his face. "My God," he whispered. "It's a complete avulsion. And look at that bleed." He looked up, his eyes finding Alara. "Who made this diagnosis?" "I did," Alara said simply, detaching the portable monitor and seamlessly connecting the boy to the OR's system. Evans stared at her for a long moment. He had seen her around the hospital, another anonymous face in the sea of blue scrubs. He had never given her a second thought. Now, he looked at her as if seeing her for the first time. He saw the precision in her movements, the cold, calm authority in her eyes. He saw a peer. No, he saw something more. "Get him on the table," Evans commanded his team, his voice now stripped of all arrogance. "Let's move, people. This nurse just bought us a few minutes. Let's not waste them." He looked at Alara again. "You're staying. I want your hands in here. You know this injury better than anyone." It wasn't a question. It was a plea. A master surgeon was asking a floor nurse for help. Alara simply nodded, stripping off her outer scrub shirt and moving to the scrub sinks. As she washed her hands, she could see the reflection of the operating room in the polished steel of the faucet. She saw Chloe, standing by the door, her face a mask of awe. She saw Dr. Evans and his team swarming over the small boy on the table. And she saw her own reflection. The face was the same. The lines of exhaustion and sorrow were still there. But the eyes were different. The ghost was gone. The commander was back. The surgery was a brutal, desperate affair. It was a race against time, a battle fought on the microscopic scale of blood vessels and torn tissue. Dr. Evans was a master craftsman, his hands moving with the speed and confidence of a man who had spent 30 years inside the human chest. But the damage was even worse than the ultrasound had shown. The spleen was not just lacerated. It was shattered, a pulpy mess that had to be removed entirely. The diaphragm was torn completely away from the chest wall, and the boy's stomach and small intestine had been forced up into his thoracic cavity, collapsing his left lung. Alara worked opposite Evans, her movements a mirror of his, but with a different quality. Where his were fast and aggressive, hers were impossibly precise and economical. She did not speak unless spoken to. She anticipated his every need, a retractor appearing in his line of sight a second before he asked for it, a suture ready in her hand the instant he finished a tie. Her contribution was quiet, almost invisible, but it changed the entire rhythm of the operation. She was a force multiplier. With her there, the efficiency of the entire team doubled. The frantic, desperate energy of the room settled into a focused, lethal hum. "More suction," Evans grunted, fighting to get a clear view of the aortic tear. Before he had finished the sentence, Alara had already adjusted the suction tip, clearing the field in a single, deft motion. 4-0 proline, he commanded a moment later. Alara had it separated from the pack and slapped it into his hand before the circulating nurse had even turned around. Evans began to rely on her, not just for instruments, but for tactical advice. "I can't get good exposure on this bleeder behind the stomach," he said, his frustration mounting. "Retract the fundus superiorly and medially," Alara said, her voice low and even. "Use a Babcock clamp. It will rotate the hilum into view." Evans paused, considered it for a second, then nodded to the scrub nurse. "Give me a Babcock." He followed Alara's instruction, and suddenly, the source of the bleeding, a torn gastric artery, presented itself perfectly. He looked across the table at her, his eyes wide with respect over the top of his surgical mask. "Where in the hell did you learn that?" "A different hospital," Alara replied, her tone leaving no room for follow-up questions. For 2 hours, they fought. They clamped, they cut, they sutured. They pulled the herniated organs out of the boy's chest and repaired the gaping hole in his diaphragm. They chased down every last bleeder, transfusing unit after unit of blood to replace what he had lost. Slowly, miraculously, they began to win. The bleeding slowed. The boy's blood pressure began to stabilize, this time for real. The frantic beeping of the monitors subsided into a steady, rhythmic pulse. Finally, Evans placed the last suture in the boy's skin. He stripped off his gloves and stepped back from the table, his shoulders slumping with exhaustion. The room, which had been a hive of intense activity, fell quiet. On the table, the small boy, Leo, lay stabilized, his chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm, driven by the ventilator. He was alive. Against all odds, he was alive. Evans looked at Alara, who was calmly wiping down her instruments. "I've been a surgeon for 30 years, he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I've never seen anything like that. The diagnosis in the ER, the assistant here. You didn't just help save him, Nurse Vance. You saved him. He would have been dead before he ever got to this room." Alara simply nodded, her work finished. She stripped off her own gloves and gown and walked out of the OR, leaving behind a room full of people who were looking at her as if she had just performed an act of God. Chloe was waiting for her in the hallway, her face pale. "Is he?" "He's stable," Alara said. The fire in her eyes had dimmed, replaced by profound weariness. The commander was retreating, and the ghost was beginning to return. But before the mask could fully settle back into place, they heard it. A deep, rhythmic whump, whump, whump that grew steadily louder, vibrating through the very structure of the hospital. It was a sound that did not belong in the city, a sound of war and remote battlefields. It was the sound of a helicopter, but it was heavier, more powerful than the light medical choppers that usually landed on the roof. Through the large window at the end of the corridor, they saw it. A UH-60 Blackhawk, painted in matte, non-reflective black, was descending toward the hospital's helipad, its powerful rotors kicking up a storm of debris. It was a vision of pure, unadulterated military power, a shark descending into a goldfish pond. Just as the helicopter touched down, the elevator doors at the end of the hall opened. Dr. Alistair Finch stepped out. His face was a wreck. The arrogant mask had been shattered, leaving behind a gray, hollowed-out man. He had clearly been waiting, stewing in his own humiliation and fear. He saw Alara and walked toward her, his steps uncertain. "Vance," he began, his voice raspy. I don't know what to say. I was wrong. He was cut off by the sound of heavy boots striding down the corridor. A man in a perfectly pressed army general's uniform, his chest a constellation of ribbons, rounded the corner. He was tall, with iron gray hair and a face that looked like it had been carved from granite. He was flanked by the 2 uniformed men from the ER. His eyes scanned the hallway and found Alara. The hard lines of his face softened instantly, with a look of immense relief and profound respect. He ignored Dr. Finch completely, walking right past him as if he were a coat rack. He stopped a respectful 3 feet from Alara. He did not look at the tired, unassuming nurse in the slightly too large scrubs. He looked at the legend he had come to find. He brought his heels together with a faint, sharp click and raised his hand in a crisp salute. "Major Vance," he said, his voice a low, resonant baritone that commanded immediate attention. It's good to see you, Anvil. Chloe gasped. Major? Anvil? The code word from the ER. Dr. Finch stared, his mind refusing to connect the dots. The quiet, clumsy nurse he had tormented for months. A major? Alara looked at the general. A flicker of her old self, the self she had tried to bury, surfaced in her eyes. General Thorne, she said, her voice flat. What are you doing here? She did not return the salute. In the civilian world, she was no longer a major. General Thorne lowered his hand, his expression understanding. We had an incident at Fort Irwin. A training exercise went bad. Catastrophic systems failure on a new vehicle prototype. We have a dozen men with complex crush injuries and internal blast wave trauma. The local surgeons are good, but they've never seen anything like it. They're losing them, Alara. He took a step closer. When we heard about the pileup here, I took a chance. I was praying we might find you. He glanced around the hospital corridor, at the stunned faces of Chloe and Finch. Forgive me, he said, his voice now addressed to them, but his eyes still on Alara. For those of you who do not know, this is Major Alara Vance, call sign Anvil. She was the command surgeon for the 7th Special Operations Medical Group. She is, without exaggeration, the single most decorated and effective combat medic of the last 50 years. The procedures she developed for controlling hemorrhaging in the field are now the gold standard for every medic in the United States military. She has saved more lives in impossible situations than anyone I have ever known. He turned back to Alara, his voice dropping, becoming a plea. The official record says you retired. We all knew you just vanished. You needed your peace. I respected that. But I have men dying, Alara. Men who won't last the hour. They need Anvil. I am not ordering you. I am asking you. Will you come? The hallway was silent. The only sound was the distant, idling thrum of the Blackhawk's turbines. Dr. Finch looked as though he had been physically struck. The mouse. The slow, incompetent nurse he had publicly humiliated for sport. A legendary surgeon? A war hero? The chasm between his perception and the reality was so vast it made him dizzy. He felt a wave of nausea. Every condescending word, every dismissive gesture, every single moment of his arrogant cruelty replayed in his mind, now cast in the horrifying light of the truth. He had not been punching down at a subordinate. He had been mocking a giant who had chosen to walk amongst ants. Alara looked at General Thorne. She looked at Chloe, whose face was a beautiful, shining portrait of vindication and awe. She looked at the shell-shocked Dr. Finch, a man utterly broken by the revelation of his own ignorance. Then her gaze went distant, back to the operating room, to the small boy whose life she had just held in her hands. She had run from her past, from the trauma and the weight of command. She had sought anonymity as a shield. But the core of who she was, the duty, the skill, the unbreakable will to stand between a life and the darkness, it had never left her. It had simply been dormant. Today, the crisis had awakened it, and now the past had come to claim it. She took a deep breath. The weariness was still there, but underneath it, a new fire was kindling. It was not the cold fire of the crisis, but the warm, steady flame of purpose. The two halves of her life, the hidden master and the quiet nurse, were no longer at war. They were integrating, becoming one. She gave a single, sharp nod to General Thorne. "Brief me on the way," she said. Her voice was calm, professional, and absolute. It was the voice of command. The general's shoulders sagged with relief. "Thank you, Major." He turned to one of his aides. "Get her a kit." Alara started walking toward the elevators that led to the roof. She paused beside Chloe. She placed a hand on the young nurse's shoulder. "You did good work today," she said softly. "You listened. You trusted. Never lose that." Chloe just stared, tears welling in her eyes, unable to speak. She just nodded. It was the highest praise she had ever received. As Alara and the general's entourage moved past Dr. Finch, he finally found his voice, a pathetic, strangled whisper. "Major Vance, I'm sorry." Alara stopped. She turned and looked at him, truly looked at him, for the first time. There was no anger in her eyes. There was no triumph. There was only a profound, clinical pity. "Your apology is irrelevant, Doctor," she said, her voice even. "What matters is that a child is alive who would have been dead. Learn from it." With that, she turned and walked away, not looking back. She stepped into the elevator with General Thorne, the doors closing on the world she was leaving behind. Dr. Finch stood alone in the hallway, the echo of her words ringing in his ears. Learn from it. It was a diagnosis of his soul, and the prognosis was grim. His career was over. His reputation was shattered. But worse than that, his entire sense of self, built on a foundation of ego and perceived superiority, had been demolished. He was the ghost now. On the roof, the wind from the Black Hawk's rotors was a physical force, tearing at their clothes. Alara didn't even blink. An aide handed her a tactical medical kit, a familiar weight. She slung it over her shoulder as she climbed into the cavernous interior of the helicopter. As she settled into a seat, she looked down at the city lights, a glittering tapestry of life and struggle. For years, she had tried to be just one of those tiny, anonymous lights. But that was not who she was. She was a beacon, meant to burn brightest in the darkest storms. The helicopter lifted off, its powerful engines roaring to life. It banked steeply, turning east toward the desert and the dying men who were waiting for Anvil. In the days that followed, the story of what happened spread through Metropolitan General like wildfire. It became a legend, told and retold in break rooms and cafeterias, each telling adding a new layer of myth. They talked about the impossible diagnosis, the defiance of Dr. Finch, the arrival of the Black Hawk, the revelation of her true identity. Alara Vance, the mouse, was gone. In her place was the legend of Major Vance, the ghost commander of the ER. Dr. Finch was placed on indefinite administrative leave the next day. An internal review board was convened, and his handling of the mass casualty incident, specifically the case of Leo, was scrutinized. His career, for all intents and purposes, was over. He had not been fired for being wrong. He had been disgraced for being arrogant, for allowing his ego to endanger a life. He had failed the most fundamental test of leadership. Chloe became a different kind of legend. She was the one who had been there, the one who had seen it all. Senior residents and attending physicians now approached her with a new respect, asking her questions not just about patients, but about Alara. What was she like? What did she say? Chloe, once timid and new, now walked the halls with a quiet confidence. She had seen what true competence looked like, and it had changed her forever. She had learned the lesson Alara had taught Finch: to listen, to observe, and to trust skill over status. 2 weeks later, a letter arrived for the hospital administrator. It was from the Department of Defense. It contained a formal commendation for the hospital's role in the I-5 incident, and a personal, handwritten note from General Marcus Thorne. The note was brief. It stated that, thanks to the initial, life-saving intervention by Major Alara Vance and the subsequent surgical care at Metropolitan General, the child, Leo, would make a full recovery. It went on to say that Major Vance's actions at Fort Irwin had resulted in the saving of 11 out of 12 critically injured soldiers, a feat the Army's own top surgeons had deemed impossible. Attached to the letter was another, sealed envelope, addressed simply to Alara Vance. The administrator, a man who now held Alara's name in something approaching religious awe, had it hand-delivered to her small, unassuming apartment. Alara had returned to the city 3 days after she had left in the Black Hawk. She had quietly resigned her position at the hospital, packed her few belongings, and was preparing to disappear again. She read the general's letter. It wasn't an order or a request. It was an offer. The military was creating a new position, Director of the Advanced Trauma Response and Innovation Command. It was a national-level role, responsible for training, protocol development, and rapid deployment to mass casualty events, both civilian and military. They weren't asking her to come back to her old life. They were asking her to build a new one, a role that would use every ounce of her skill and experience to save lives on a scale she had never imagined. The world has too much chaos, Anvil, the general had written. It needs more people like you to stand against it. Not in the shadows, but in the light. Stop doing penance. Start leading. Alara sat with the letter for a long time, the paper resting in her scarred hands. The ghost in her whispered that she should run, that she should find another quiet corner of the world to hide in. But another voice, her own, finally answered back. It was time to stop running. It was time to accept who she was. All of it. The skill, the trauma, the burden, and the gift. She picked up her phone and made a call. General Thorne's office, a crisp voice answered. This is Major Vance, Alara said, her voice clear and steady. Tell the general I accept. Her choice was made. The integration was complete. She would no longer be a ghost, haunted by the past. She would be a commander, building the future. The quiet nurse who read in the corner was gone for good, and in her place stood the woman she was always meant to be. The story of Alara Vance, the hidden master, teaches us a profound lesson about the nature of expertise and the fallibility of perception. We live in a world that often confuses volume with value, and arrogance with authority. We are conditioned to look for leaders who are loud, who are polished, who wear the trappings of power with confidence and flair. We are drawn to the Dr. Finches of the world because their certainty is a comforting illusion in times of chaos. We mistake their ego for competence. But true mastery is rarely loud. True strength is quiet. It does not need to announce itself. It does not require validation from others. It is forged in discipline, honed by experience, and revealed not by words, but by action. It is the quiet, meticulous nurse who prepares an IV line with religious precision. Not because she is slow, but because she understands the profound consequences of a single mistake. It is the unassuming figure who sees what everyone else misses, not through some magical intuition, but through a lifetime of dedicated observation. If you think true skill is often mistaken for normal comment, that is unfair. Alara Vance wore her anonymity like a cloak, a form of self-imposed penance for a past she could not escape. She sought to be invisible, to be the mouse.